There's a photograph of my grandmother's kitchen from 1957 that I keep in a drawer, and the thing I notice every time I look at it isn't the stove or the curtains or the linoleum floor. It's how empty the counters are. Not bare, not neglected, just clear. A percolator, a bread box, a small ceramic canister set, and nothing else visible on any surface in the entire room. The kitchen I was standing in the day I found that photograph had so much sitting on every counter that I couldn't have set a cutting board down without moving 3 things out of the way first. That was the afternoon I decided to find out exactly what my grandmother's generation knew about running a kitchen that mine had somehow completely forgotten. Here are 15 of those habits, and what happened to my own kitchen once I actually started using them. The first one was the simplest and probably the most important of all 15 on this list. So simple that it almost sounds like it shouldn't need to be said out loud at all. Everything in my grandmother's kitchen had one specific place it belonged, and it went back to that exact place the moment it was finished being used, not 10 minutes later, not after dinner, not tomorrow morning when I'd get around to it eventually. The whisk went back in the drawer. The cutting board went back against the wall beside the stove. The measuring cups went back on the hook screwed into the inside of the cabinet door, hanging there in order from largest to smallest, the same way they'd hung since the day she put them up. I started enforcing this on myself with an almost stubborn, unreasonable level of discipline, the kind of discipline that felt a little ridiculous at first, putting a spatula back in a drawer while something was still sizzling on the stove, rather than setting it down on the counter for even a minute. And within a single week, the constant visual chaos on every surface had dropped by what felt like half, without my throwing out or getting rid of a single thing in the entire kitchen. The mess, it turned out, had never really been about owning too much. It was about nothing having a home to go back to when it wasn't actively in someone's hand. Dishes got washed immediately after a meal, not stacked in the sink waiting for a load big enough to justify running the dishwasher, not left soaking in soapy water that went cold hours ago while I told myself I'd get to them later, definitely later, probably before bed. My grandmother washed as she cooked, a pot rinsed the moment its contents moved to a serving dish, a mixing bowl cleaned before the batter even made it into the oven, and whatever was left after the actual meal got done, before anyone in the house sat down to relax for the evening. I started doing the same, standing at the sink with hot water running, while dinner was still warm on the table behind me, and the feeling of walking into a completely clean kitchen the next morning, nothing in the sink, nothing on the drying rack, nothing waiting for me to deal with before I could even start my day, was worth every one of those 5 or 6 minutes it actually cost me the night before. It changed my entire relationship with my own kitchen, from a room I slightly dreaded entering in the morning to one I actually looked forward to walking into. Counter space was treated almost like a precious resource in her generation, something you actively protected rather than gradually surrendered to whatever happened to land on it over the course of a week, one item at a time, until you couldn't see the surface underneath anymore. I went through every single thing sitting on my countertops one Saturday morning with a simple, ruthless question for each one. Do I actually use this every single day, or is it just living here because I set it down one afternoon and never moved it again? The toaster stayed. The coffee maker stayed. The decorative cookie jar that hadn't held an actual cookie in over 2 years went into a cabinet where it could sit unused in private. The stack of mail that had been slowly growing beside the microwave for the better part of a month went into a basket by the front door, where it actually belonged, since it had nothing to do with cooking in the first place. The electric can opener I used maybe once every 2 weeks went into a drawer. By the end of that Saturday morning, I had more usable counter space than I'd seen in years, genuinely years, and the kitchen already looked like an entirely different room, brighter, calmer, and somehow bigger than it had felt the night before with the exact same walls around it. Leftovers went into proper containers and into the refrigerator the moment a meal was finished and everyone had served themselves what they wanted, not left sitting on the stove in the pot they were cooked in, lid half on, cooling slowly for hours while I told myself I'd deal with them before bed, and then sometimes forgot entirely until the next morning. My grandmother had a specific shelf in her icebox for leftovers, Always the same shelf, always in the same kind of glass container with a proper lid, arranged so she could open the door and see immediately what needed to be used up next, without digging through a cluttered mess of mismatched lids, foil-covered bowls, and forgotten plates pushed to the back with something growing on them. I set up the exact same system in my own refrigerator, one shelf dedicated entirely to leftovers in clear containers, labels facing forward if I was feeling particularly organized that day. And the amount of perfectly good food I've stopped accidentally wasting since then is genuinely embarrassing to think about compared to what I was routinely throwing away before, without ever stopping to add it up. The pantry got organized by category, rather than by whenever I happened to have last bought something and shoved it in wherever it would physically fit at the time. Cans stacked on top of bags, bags leaning against boxes, the whole thing a kind of archaeological record of every grocery trip I'd taken in the past 6 months. Oldest items buried deepest. Baking supplies together on one shelf, canned goods lined up together on another, grains and pasta and rice grouped on their own section of a third shelf, each category always in the same spot it was always going to live in from now on. My grandmother's pantry, from what I remember of it as a child standing on tiptoe to look inside, looked like a small, well-run grocery store aisle. Everything facing forward with the label showing, everything visible at a single glance, nothing hiding behind anything else. Mine had looked like a closet someone had thrown things into with their eyes closed for the better part of a decade, a place I dreaded opening because I knew I'd have to move 6 things to find the one thing I actually needed. Getting it right took one long afternoon with a roll of shelf liner, a damp cloth, and more patience than I expected to need. But it's stayed organized since with almost no effort at all, because the system itself does the maintenance work once you've actually taken the time to set it up properly. A cleaning routine that happened daily rather than whenever things got bad enough to finally force it was maybe the single biggest shift in how my kitchen actually felt to walk into each morning. The difference between a room that welcomed you and a room that quietly accused you of something the moment you turned on the light. My grandmother wiped down every surface after every meal, swept the floor at the end of every day, and scrubbed the sink with baking soda before she went to bed, the same exact sequence every single night, performed in the same order every time, without ever once skipping it or deciding she was too tired to bother just this one time. I copied that sequence exactly, wrote it on a card, and stuck it to the inside of a cabinet door so I wouldn't have to think about what came next. And the kitchen hasn't needed a full, exhausting deep clean since, not once, because there's never enough buildup anywhere on any surface to actually require one. Small daily effort replacing one large, dreaded, overwhelming weekend project, performed over and over with almost no thought required, until the weekend project simply stopped needing to exist at all. Buying only what was actually written on a list, and absolutely nothing else, was a discipline my grandmother practiced every single time she walked into a grocery store, a habit I'd heard her mention 100 times growing up, but never once managed to stick to myself until this year, always letting my eyes and my appetite make decisions my list hadn't authorized. I started writing a complete list before every grocery trip, checking the pantry shelf by shelf and the refrigerator door by door before I ever left the house, and buying nothing, not one single thing, that wasn't already written down in my own handwriting, no matter how appealing it looked sitting on a shelf as I walked past it, or how convinced I was in the moment that I'd definitely use it this time. The amount of random, unplanned food that used to accumulate in my kitchen, things I bought on pure impulse and then forgot about completely until they expired quietly and shamefully in the back of a cabinet months later, dropped almost to zero within the first month of actually following this one rule. It's worth pausing here for a second, because I noticed something specific about halfway through this whole experiment that I think matters more than any single habit on this list, taken by itself. Something that changed how I understood every habit that came before it, and every one that came after. The reason my grandmother's kitchen stayed clean, effortlessly, permanently clean in a way mine had never once managed to be for more than a few days after a deep clean, wasn't because she spent more time cleaning than I did. She almost certainly spent less, in total hours measured across a full week, than I was spending on my own periodic, desperate, exhausting deep cleans every few Saturdays when the guilt and the mess finally became too much to keep ignoring. The difference was that her effort was spread thin and even across every single day, a few minutes here, a few minutes there, woven into the natural rhythm of cooking and eating and putting things away, rather than concentrated into one miserable, resentful Saturday morning every few weeks, when things had finally gotten bad enough that I couldn't stand looking at my own kitchen anymore without feeling like a failure. The total time invested was genuinely less. The result was consistently visibly better. And the only thing the whole approach actually required was consistency rather than motivation, which, it turns out, is a much more reliable foundation to build any kind of daily system around. Because consistency doesn't need you to feel like doing it on any particular day in order to still get done. Spices got stored in a single, organized rack or shallow drawer, rather than a cluttered cabinet where half of them were permanently hidden behind the other half. Some of them expired years ago without my ever noticing. Duplicates of things I'd bought again and again because I genuinely couldn't see the one I already owned, sitting right behind 3 other jars I'd also forgotten were there in the first place. I pulled every single spice out of my cabinet one afternoon, lined them all up on the counter in a row that turned out to be disturbingly long, threw away anything expired, eliminated every duplicate, and organized what remained into a single shallow drawer where every label was visible from above, without moving a single jar to reach the one behind it. I haven't bought a duplicate spice since, which, before this, used to happen to me at least once a month, sometimes more. Each one a small waste of money that was really a symptom of a much larger organizational failure I'd been ignoring for years. Garbage and recycling went out daily rather than sitting in an overflowing bin in the corner of the kitchen until someone in the house finally couldn't ignore it anymore and took it out under mild protest, sometimes accompanied by the kind of sigh that's really a complaint disguised as an exhale. My grandmother's kitchen never smelled like garbage, not once in all the years I spent time in it, and the reason, it turned out, wasn't that she had a better bin or a more powerful air freshener. The reason was simply that garbage was never allowed to sit there long enough to actually start smelling like anything at all. A small habit, barely worth mentioning on its own in a list this long, but a kitchen that genuinely never smells like yesterday's scraps feels fundamentally different to walk into than one that sometimes does, in a way that affects everything else about how willing you are to actually spend time in the room. The refrigerator got a thorough check once a week, the same day every week, before the grocery trip happened rather than after it. Anything past its best, anything forgotten in a container pushed to the back, anything slowly going soft in the crisper drawer got pulled out and dealt with honestly before new food went in on top of it to hide it for another week. My grandmother's refrigerator, every single time I ever opened it as a child, looked like it had been arranged by someone who actually cared about knowing what was inside and wanted to see it all at a single glance. Mine, before this year, looked like evidence of several small crimes committed against various innocent vegetables over a period of weeks, things I'd bought with the best of intentions and then abandoned to their fate behind a bottle of something I also wasn't using. The weekly check takes maybe 10 minutes, standing there with the door open, making honest decisions about what's genuinely still good and what I've been avoiding dealing with, what it prevents, in wasted food, and in the slow, creeping buildup of a refrigerator that makes you faintly uneasy every time you actually open the door, is worth considerably more than the small amount of time it costs. Dish towels got replaced on a set schedule rather than whenever they finally started looking noticeably worn or smelling faintly damp, no matter how many times they went through the wash, that particular sour smell you learn to ignore after a while, but that visitors absolutely notice the moment they step into your kitchen. My grandmother always had a stack of fresh ones folded neatly in a specific drawer, rotated in every 2 or 3 days without fail, the used ones going straight into the laundry basket without any internal debate about whether they were really still good enough for one more day before the next wash. I started doing the same, buying a few extra plain white towels to pad the rotation out, and the simple act of reaching for a towel that's genuinely clean, dry, and fresh-smelling, rather than one that's been hanging damp on the oven door handle for the better part of a week, changed something small but surprisingly real about how the whole kitchen felt to work in. A crispness to the room that had been quietly missing for longer than I'd realized. Seasonal kitchen items, the turkey roaster that came out once in November, the cookie press that appeared for exactly 2 weeks in December, the ice cream maker that got used a handful of times each summer and never in any other month, anything that only justified its existence a few times a year, got stored somewhere other than the kitchen itself. A high shelf in a hallway closet, a labeled bin in the garage, anywhere accessible, but out of the way until the actual season arrived and the item was genuinely needed. My grandmother's kitchen only contained the things she used on a regular, ongoing basis. Nothing more, nothing sitting idle for months on end, taking up cabinet space something else needed. Everything seasonal lived elsewhere until it was specifically called for, which meant the kitchen itself never had to stretch to accommodate things that were taking up valuable real estate 11 months out of 12 for absolutely no practical reason. A meal plan for the entire week, written out in full before any shopping happened at all, stuck to a consistent schedule of what got cooked on which specific day, was the habit that tied every single one of the others together and made the whole system actually function without constant, exhausting decision-making, draining my energy and my patience every single afternoon around 5. My grandmother knew on Monday morning what she was cooking on Thursday evening, and she'd already bought exactly what she needed for it. The right amount, no more, no less, no last-minute substitutions with whatever happened to be left, no standing in front of an open refrigerator at 5 in the afternoon, trying to assemble something edible from whatever odds and ends hadn't expired since the last time she'd done the same thing. I started writing a simple meal plan every Sunday evening. Nothing elaborate, just a card stuck to the refrigerator door with a magnet listing each evening's dinner beside the day of the week, and the daily question of what to cook, a question that used to consume a genuinely unreasonable amount of mental energy every single afternoon of my life, simply stopped existing entirely, replaced by a glance at a card and the quiet satisfaction of already knowing the answer. And the last habit, the one that holds all 14 others together like a keystone and makes them actually sustainable over months and years, rather than a burst of motivated effort that fades quietly within a few weeks once the initial excitement wears off, is the evening reset. Every single night, after the last dish is washed and the counters are wiped and the floor is swept, I spend 5 minutes walking slowly through the kitchen and putting it back to exactly the state I want to find it in when I walk in the next morning. The bread box is closed. The dish towel is fresh, the old one in the basket. The table is completely clear. The sink is empty and dry. Nothing is left out. Nothing is left undone. Nothing carries over into tomorrow as a small, nagging, unfinished task I'll have to deal with before I can even begin to start my actual day. My grandmother did this every single night of her life, as far as I ever knew, without ever once calling it a routine, or a method, or a system, or a reset, or any of the words we've invented since to describe what is, at its core, simply finishing the day's work before calling the day finished. It was the last thing that happened in her kitchen before the light went off, the same way locking the front door was the last thing that happened before going to bed. Automatic and unremarkable, and completely non-negotiable. It took her 5 minutes then. It takes me 5 minutes now, and the kitchen I walk into every single morning looks, finally, after all of this, a little bit like that photograph from 1957. Clear counters, clean sink, everything in its place, the whole room quietly ready for whatever comes next. None of this required buying a single organizing product, downloading an app, or following a complicated system with steps and stages I'd need a manual to remember by the time Wednesday rolled around. It required 15 small habits, practiced consistently, day after day, the same way they were practiced without comment or complaint or any sense of special effort by an entire generation of women who never once thought of themselves as unusually tidy or particularly disciplined or doing anything remarkable at all. They were simply doing what a kitchen required, every single day, without ever waiting for it to become a problem big enough to finally force them into action. I look at that photograph from 1957 sometimes, when my kitchen is clean and quiet at the end of an evening, the counters clear, the sink empty, the dish towel fresh on its hook, and it doesn't look like a relic from another era to me anymore. It looks like proof that it was always this simple, and that the only thing standing between my kitchen and hers was a set of habits so small that each one, on its own, barely seemed worth the effort of naming. If your own kitchen has been slowly getting away from you the way mine had, quietly, one unfinished task at a time, until the whole room felt like something to be managed rather than enjoyed, it might be worth starting with just one of these 15, the smallest one, the one that sounds the easiest to actually hold to every single day without exception. See what your own counters look like after a week of actually doing it. You might be surprised how quickly one habit turns into two, and two turns into a kitchen that finally looks the way you always wanted it to, without a single exhausting weekend deep clean to show for it.